And welcome. Hi, I'm Mike Lewis, and I'm here with David D.W. Lafferty. We are the Critical Catholic. We are a live stream show dedicated to helping Catholics think critically about issues such as conspiracy theories, cutting through rumors, and finding the truth, focusing on the truth. Today is part two of our conversation, hopefully our concluding part of the conversation on the conspiracy theories and rumors surrounding the death of Pope John Paul I. Pope John Paul I was Pope for 33 days in 1978. He was elected after the death of Pope St. Paul VI. And after his death on September 28th of that year, Pope John Paul II was elected and took the same name. So, David, welcome.
Hey, Mike. How are things?
Good. Happy Father's Day. Is it Father's Day in Canada? Or
It is. Yeah. Okay. So happy Father's Day to you as well. And happy Father's Day to all the dads out there watching.
That's right.
Hopefully you had a good day.
Hopefully you were given the opportunity. Maybe your children got you a Patreon subscribership to Where Peter Is.
Perfect gift.
Perfect Father's Day gift.
Perfect gift. Yeah.
Get your father something to help him learn about the Holy Father. And happy Father's Day to Pope Francis. And
yes,
Pope Emeritus Benedict, who's still plugging along.
He is.
Over 8 years later. Wow. So David, I was thinking that in this episode, first, we talked about the sequence of events surrounding the death of John Paul I, that basically went to bed the evening of September 27th at 9:20 p.m., I think is the timeline. And that was the last time he was seen. And then he was discovered in the early morning hours.
Yeah, sorry. It was actually, I should say, it was September 28th that he allegedly died. It was that evening, and then it was September 29th when he was found dead. So sorry, there's a little confusion there.
Oh, so they're thinking he died 11 p.m. or something like that. Is that the official date of death would be that he died after he went to bed?
Estimated, yes. Yeah. And there's a lot of controversy about that because, it's difficult to determine.
So we could do a whole episode on whether his official date of death should be the 29th rather than the 28th.
Or the 28th, yeah.
I don't know. I think I'm going to push for the 29th to be the official date, just to be.
Yeah, I think that's safe. That's when his body was discovered. We know for sure that, he was definitely deceased by the 29th. So that works. But this is something that you can dig into endlessly. It's that kind of old style conspiracy theory where there's, just this infinite number of factors and elements that can be examined from all different perspectives. And there's lots of conflicting narratives. There's lots of data that you can look at, but nothing that gives you like the full clear picture. So it's, it's really reminiscent of stuff like, JFK assassination stuff, although JFK really was assassinated, but in the way that, people can really dig into this in a semi-legitimate way, because you're often dealing with stuff that actually was reported, stuff that, there is a sort of factual basis for it, but there's a lot of conflicting information there. So it's a little different from some of the conspiracy theories that we look at where there's just nothing, nothing solid to grab onto. A lot of it is just kind of fantasy or just rumor. But yeah, this is one of those ones where you can really dig into it. And we were thinking, maybe we could, because we weren't 100% clear maybe last time about the circumstances around it surrounding his death, before we get into the other aspect of what we want to talk about with John Paul the First, which is the stuff with Freemasons, stuff with financial corruption that all could potentially have played into this. We thought maybe it would be a good idea to just go through the timeline and just to make that clear, because maybe we kind of skipped over it a little bit last episode. Maybe before we do that, though, we'll do a quick prayer to get us started. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, please guide us in our discussion. Help us to dispel confusion, discern fact from fiction, and to cleave to the truth. Allow us to contribute to the creation of a healthy Catholic media culture. Amen.
Amen.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. So I have the David Yallop book, and the David Yallop book is the In God's Name. I think, yeah, you got it there. Perfect. Thanks, Mike. That is the book that kind of set off the official conspiracy theory regarding John Paul the First, and it's still, the central text.
And I believe it's pretty easily accessible still. Obviously, not recommending it as a source of truth, but just to satiate your curiosity, or to for your own personal study, or just to see his point of view and give him a hearing. It's readily available. I think it's even on Kindle for only something like $5. So it was a bestseller, and it flooded the marketplace in the early '80s, and you can still get a copy of it pretty easily.
You could probably find it in a lot of used bookstores these days. It's that kind of, best-selling paperback that a lot of people, were reading in airports and things like that, or on the beach back in the day. So yeah, it's readily available. It actually is a good read. And if you take it with a big grain of salt, realizing that he's really got this idea that he wants to prove that Pope John Paul I was murdered. There's actually a lot of really interesting information in there. You just want to double check everything. And one thing I should mention about the Yallop book, he reconstructs conversations that he thinks had happened. So he learned of, say, a meeting between John Paul I and Cardinal Villot, and then he kind of reconstructs what they might have talked about. But he presents it, and he mentions that at the very beginning, but he presents it in the book as if you might mistake this for like documented conversation.
This is what happened next. And if you didn't read at the beginning of the book that he said that stuff is all made up, then yeah. So you really gotta know that ahead of time. But if you just look at the facts he presents, and you can challenge those facts, absolutely, that it's a good starting point for looking into all this anyway. So according to his timeline, it was September 28th, 1978, when John Paul I went to bed in the papal apartments. He had beside his bed, again, this is all according to Yallop, so gets challenged all the time. He had an alarm clock and a bottle of a medicine called Effertil that he used for his low blood pressure. And then the only other things he was taking were, at that time, apparently, were some vitamins and adrenal injections, again, for his low blood pressure. But those injections weren't a regular thing. So he goes to bed. In the morning, a sister, Vincenza, comes at 4:30 a.m. as usual, to put a flask of coffee outside of the room, and to knock on the door to wake him up. And I think what usually would happen is she'd knock on the door, she'd go away, he would eventually come out and have his coffee. But she left, then she came back at 4:45, so 15 minutes later. The coffee was still there. No one hadn't been disturbed. He was not a guy who would usually sleep in. So she knocks, no answer. She enters the bedroom, and I'll just quote from Yallop's book here. Quote, opening the door, she saw Albino Luciani sitting up in bed. He was wearing his glasses, and gripped in his hands were some sheets of paper. His head was turned to the right, and lips were parted, showing his teeth. It was not the smiling face that had so impressed the millions, but an expression of agony. And she feels his pulse. That's the end of the quote. She feels his pulse. She realizes that
he's dead. And she goes to wake up a number of people who were in the vicinity, sleeping at the time. And one of those is Don Diego Lorenzi, and he's actually the first, apparently, to enter the bedroom after her and see his body. And then the next person to come in is Father McGee. I can't remember now exactly how Lorenzi and McGee are related to the Pope at this
McGee was the secretary, I believe.
Secretary, yes. Okay, I think he was the secretary, yeah. Father McGee telephones the Secretary of State, Cardinal Villot, who is 2 floors below. And Villot comes up by 5 o'clock in the morning and confirms that the Pope is dead. And now, again, this is according to Yallop's narrative of what he believes happened. Villot took the medicine that was on the side table and puts it in his pocket and removes a number of other things that were supposed to have been there. Apparently, his will was supposed to have been at his desk. His glasses and his slippers are removed. And then, again, according to Yallop, Villot basically tells everyone assembled there a story about how we're going to say the Pope died and swears everyone to silence as to anything that they saw. And so they kind of have to follow the narrative. And then he starts making phone calls. So he calls, apparently, I'm going to mess his name up, but Cardinal Confalonieri, who's the Dean of the Sacred College, then Cardinal Casaroli, and then a number of others, including Dr. Renato Buzanetti, who is the deputy head of the Vatican Health Service. So Buzanetti, I believe, comes to the location, and let me just make sure. Yeah, it does a brief examination of the body, and according to Buzanetti, the death is caused by, and I'm quoting here from Yallop's book, acute myocardial infarction, so a heart attack. And the doctor puts the time of death at about 11 p.m. on the previous evening. That's all a quote from the book. Now, Yallop says that it's impossible to determine the time of death through such a brief examination. And it sounds like that might actually be true, that this is not something that can be done all that easily. Now, once everything is sort of under control, and it seems to be Cardinal Villot is leading this whole operation.
So what time in the morning are we talking at this point?
We're still, apparently, most people did not even know that he had died by around 7 o'clock in the morning. It was still, under wraps. But although it appears the news was kind of spreading around the Vatican, Yallop says the news was starting to spread through the Vatican village. Now, this is an important detail for the sort of conspiracy angle. He says, in the courtyard near the Vatican Bank, Sergeant Rogan, I guess a guard there, met Bishop Paul Marchinkas. And Paul Marchinkas, we'd mentioned last time, he was the head of the Vatican Bank. It was 6:45 a.m. And Yallop asks what the president of the Vatican Bank, who lives in the Villa Stritch on Via della Nocetta in Rome and is not a renowned early riser, was doing in the Vatican so early remains a mystery. So now I've heard that, I haven't read his book, but John Cornwell, who wrote a book that would refute some of these ideas, apparently said that Paul Marchinkas, although he was spotted at this time, actually was an early riser, and this was his usual time for entering the coming to the Vatican Bank. So there's a lot of, again, conflicting reports about some of this stuff. Now, the official announcement that I believe it's released by Cardinal Viau that's put out is that, and again, I'll quote it here, this morning, September 29th, 1978, about 5:30, the private secretary of the Pope, contrary to custom, not having found the Holy Father in the chapel of his private apartment, looked for him in his room and found him dead in bed with the light on, like one who was intent on reading. The physician, Dr. Renato Buzanetti, who hastened at once, verified the death, which took place presumably towards 11 o'clock yesterday evening, as sudden death that could be related to acute myocardial infarction. Now, apparently later statements come out that this was Father McGee who had discovered him, and also that the Pope had been reading The Imitation of Christ, which was apparently his favorite book. Now, we were talking about this last week too, how this turned out not to be true. That at least according to Yallop, he was not discovered by Father McGee. He was not found reading The Imitation of Christ. It turned out to be, it's still unclear. It was either some papers that were related to sermons that he was, or homilies that he was looking over, or according to Yallop, it was some plans that he had laid out for curial rearrangements within the Vatican. So again, you could probably dig for a long time trying to figure this stuff out. I know John Cornwell apparently did some good work debunking some of this, showing that Yallop was actually relying on some erroneous news reports in some of his details. So it's not like Yallop was making things up, but he didn't realize that some of the news reports that were coming out were mistaken. And I mean, we see this when things happen, like around, we have like things like, say, like a mass shooting or things like that happen. There's all sorts of reports that come out all at once. Some of them turn out to be faulty, or the information is mixed up. Some people, originally they may say that, oh, there's two shooters at this event, and then they correct it and it's one shooter. But the conspiracy theorists will always look at that. Oh, at one point they reported there were two shooters, that must mean something. But no, it's just usually with any kind of event like this where everything's breaking all at once, you get some faulty news report. So I think that's something to always keep in mind.
And there was a lot less coordination back then than there, I mean, once something's in, really you had to wait until something went into print. And so if you're working for if you're covering the Vatican for a different Italian outlet, and you've got someone covering the Vatican for the Washington Post, or for, people are you're gonna file the story when you file the story, and you're gonna do your best as a journalist, but different versions come out, or you might miss the new information, or you might mishear something, and it's not like you can issue a correction to the, like nowadays, you read even like Catholic news outlets that'll revise a story that's they post a claim, like I wrote about that, the claim that CNA had that Biden was going to meet with Pope Benedict, Pope Francis. It was their breaking news just last week. And they were the only people on the planet who reported that Biden was even going to go to Rome. So it's like but then really the story that they were trying to transmit was that the Biden administration had requested that Biden attend mass at Casa Santa Marta, with Pope Francis. Why am I saying Benedict? With Pope Francis, and he was denied. So that was supposed to have sent a signal to the U.S. bishops that of whatever Francis's opinion was. But I read it and I'm like, wait, they have Biden going to Rome? That's not on his itinerary. How did they get this story?
Meanwhile, Biden's off in Russia or whatever.
But then a few hours later, they just sort of scrubbed that, that whole part about him, and they changed it to an early version of his plans, and the link redirected you to a whole new version of the story. Well, Yallop is going through the contemporary newspaper clippings at the time, and once it's in print, it's set. So there's no way to know whether it was verified or fact checked, or whether, unless somebody goes and does the digging to find out whether there was a correction in the next edition of the newspaper. You're not going to know purely based on that what happened.
That's the thing, and we got to remember, because I really I wouldn't put Yallop in the class of conspiracy theorists who are being irrational or who are just maliciously making things up. I think he really believed in what he was saying, and I could see how when you start digging into all this stuff, and you think like, oh, the puzzle pieces are coming together, it may convince you that something sinister happened here. But yeah, I think he was working with the materials he had at the time, which were very different from what we have today. Like you said, it's clippings, and you often don't have access to all of them either. Like, it's very difficult to track down. You would have had to track down all this stuff in libraries or through your own clippings and things like that.
Microfiche, and there's no Google Translate, so you're looking at Italian newspapers, and and then you have to either, if you don't speak Italian, you have to have an Italian translator come in and maybe or hire a research assistant that knows Italian and can translate it into English. Or
it appears anyway, I'm assuming he's telling the truth, that he interviewed many people, even people who were directly involved in a lot of this. So he did his work like a journalist would, like the kind of the footwork, basically. So it's different. It's, again, different from the kind of conspiracy theory where people are just, grabbing and cutting and pasting things from, blogs and Twitter, and then throwing it all together into something, while they're on their computer at 4 o'clock in the morning. So it's a little different, a different sort of thing, but I still think it is conspiracy theory nevertheless. So that gives us, just a framework to think about when we're thinking about the actual death. And I forgot to mention too that there was controversy about the embalming, which happened very quickly. So I believe it was on the night of the 29th that the embalming, at least according to Yallop, that the embalming process started. And according to him, they did not, I guess, as they normally would do, drain all the blood from the body. So I guess the normal procedure is you drain the blood from the body, replace it with, a chemical fluid or some kind of thing that helps.
Embalming fluid.
Embalming fluid, essentially, yes. So now with this process that they used, I don't know the details, but they apparently left the blood in the body. Now he believes that's because they didn't want anyone to be able to test the blood, because testing it might have shown that there was poison in it. So that's how I interpreted it.
And there's his tomb in the crypt at St. Peter's.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, I don't know I'd like to share on the timeline, in the comments. Hold on, I'm going to paste it right here. This is actually an article from Crisis Magazine in 2003. Now, keep in mind, Crisis Magazine in 2003 was a much different publication than it is today. It was largely like a neocon. People like Michael Novak and even Phyllis Zagano wrote for it in the early days. I think this was in I guess in 2003, it might have been the Deal Hudson era, but it wasn't. So this article is written by Sandra Miesel, who wrote one of my favorite articles of all time from Crisis Magazine, which was actually taken down from their website, basically telling this whole story of Catholic conspiracy theories and kind of how ridiculous they are. And it's funny because about 2 or 3 years ago, she had criticized the Remnant in the article, and the Remnant started this campaign to have that article taken down from their website, from Crisis's website, which they did because now, because Crisis's current management is a bunch of conspiracy theorists. So, it's the funny thing is, like, Crisis, the title of the magazine, it was meant to be ironic. It was sort of like neocons or more sophisticated conservatives who laughed about reactionaries who, ran around with their hair on fire and said everything was a crisis. They were supposed to bring balance. Nowadays, I think they mean it sincerely, unfortunately. But anyway, so this article here actually compares the two books, the Yallop and Cornwell books. And I thought I would just read, and this is her summary. This isn't a quote from the actual book. But this is what Cornwell concluded happened. And this adds another little wrinkle to it. Cornwell assumes that Lorenzi was out until midnight while McGee stayed up late reading about papal deaths. And the thing is, Cornwell had reconstructed how actually they talked about, John Paul talked about dying at dinner that night. McGee thought to check on the Pope en route to his own room. He saw the light on and walked in to find the Pope dead in a pitiful heap on the floor, an unseemly end. He waited for Lorenzi, and together they propped the Pope up on his bed with pillows as if reading. Without thinking to offer the last rites, they left the body to be found the next morning, not anticipating that Sister Vincenza would make the discovery first. So he thinks that the most plausible explanation, and I guess this is why the time, and also the time of death is given, before midnight on the 28th, is that he was found on the floor. The secretaries, in an attempt to create a little bit of theater or to make it seem more dignified, propped him up in bed with reading material or whatever it was, and then but the thing is, the first person to notice it in the morning, Sister Vincenza. So
in a way that actually fits with Yallop's timeline, because he just didn't think that, he didn't know potentially that if this is true, that the body was discovered before Sister Vincenza found him. So they might have propped him up, put him in the bed. Then she came at her usual time with his coffee, and all of the things that followed happened. And it would explain a fair bit. And to me, that kind of explanation does fit with the sort of Vatican culture where they try to present the Pope in the most positive possible way, and you're always trying to manage the image of the papacy and that sort of thing. So when things like this happen, they might actually consider doing something like that. We can't have the Pope be found dead on the floor, curled up. We got to get him into bed. We got to prop him up with something in his hands, like that sort of thing. And that to me seems very plausible. Unfortunately, it also gives a lot of ammunition to people who think that something shady was going on, because there was a little bit of cover up and a little bit of lying potentially that was going on there. And so it's always my preference is just tell people the truth, and then then you don't have to worry about any of this stuff, even if it's not the prettiest thing.
The funny thing is, nowadays you can really see where these things are headed. I think in the pre-internet era you didn't, but when somebody is first exposed and they give sort of a partial explanation, or you can, someone that's discriminating, somebody who's thinking about what's really going on here, or why did this person say it that way, it's like, just pull the Band-Aid off. Tell the whole story from the beginning. People die, and actually, I think John Paul II, despite the fact that they added some last words that he couldn't possibly have said, he showed the world that a pope is a person. A pope grows old, experiences ailments. I remember in the 90s, it took them a really long time to admit that he had Parkinson's. Long after anyone saw it, or long after everyone pretty much knew that's what he had. It took them, but then towards the end, I think it became very clear that he just let people know how he's doing. Don't put up a false facade. And granted, he's issuing encyclicals and making appointments,
Yeah.
from, in that condition. But
there was a lot of illusion behind the papacy anyway, like especially when it comes to encyclicals. We imagine the Pope writes everything, and it's not always the case. And I think, like there's a really good point with John Paul II, that was really powerful at the time. I remember it very well when he was so sick and ailing, but he was still making these public appearances. And it was disconcerting at first, because he was, essentially dying in front of the world slowly. But it really showed that there's a dignity in death, even though, of course, I remember South Park and stuff did stuff kind of mocking him, and you get that as well.
Probably because it was so bold and it was so unprecedented.
Yeah,
granted, people a lot of times when they're dying, they it's not like there's much good happening when you're putting them out.
Yeah,
But what tends to happen is you don't hear from somebody, when it's a public figure, it's like, oh, they're out there. And, a name comes to mind, like Regis Philbin, he was everywhere in the media. Then he retires. He's still making some appearances. Then you don't hear from Regis for a couple of years. And then you find out that he's passed away.
Yeah.
And, and I'm sure, I love Regis. I don't, but it's sort of like we didn't actually see those very last phases of his life, so we still have these memories of him as this energetic, boisterous man. And I think a lot of people don't quite understand, aren't comfortable with the idea of those last days, weeks, months. And I think John Paul really brought those. I think we need that kind of honesty.
Yeah, nowadays we're a little more comfortable with that. We've seen people, bare themselves, in these kind of ways on television or, in the public. And John Paul II was probably, the most prominent person to do that, to really age and suffer in front of the world like that. It's very, very powerful. But yeah. Okay. So anyway, that explains. We'll get back. What we should do, I think, is we should look at the other angle on this, which is this is actually the bulk of the Yalla book. And this is the stuff that has spawned a lot of follow-up, and what really got other conspiracy theorists interested in this, and just the general public interested in this. And this is the angle that involves what I'm going to call a triangle of corruption that surrounded the Vatican at that time. So this one's a bit harder to explain because there's so many elements to it, so I'm going to present it in really simple terms and see if it comes across, as something that can be understood. It gets so complex. But I got to admit, like when I was reading this stuff, I was like, I'm getting a little red pilled on this. This is, I'm starting to get into this now. Now I'm pulled back a little bit and I'm like, okay. But it is fascinating stuff. So it involves Freemasonry, but not in the way one might expect. So this involves a specific Masonic lodge in Italy that was called Propaganda Due, or P2. So just a little background on Freemasonry in Italy. Now, I actually watched on Zoom a lecture that I found a lecture I found on YouTube that had been conducted over Zoom to a group.
Send me a link to this
one, it's great. It was fantastic. It was a group of Freemasons. I think they were in Scotland. So it's like about 30 old guys on their, on their Zoom stuff. Some of them might have a pipe and stuff, and they're just kind of watching. And there's a guy who comes on, and he's a history. He's an expert in Masonic history, and he goes around lecturing to different Masonic lodges. And for whatever reason, they broadcast this live on YouTube, and it was actually a very good discussion, or a very good presentation. And he presented P2. He said, let's talk about what this P2 is. And they were all fascinated because P2 doesn't actually have anything to do with what you would call like mainstream Freemasonry. So Italy is a country where Freemasonry did play an important historic role. And that actually helps explain a little bit the emphasis on Freemasonry in some of the papal writings, especially like in the 19th century, because this is when that influence was at its peak. So around the time of unification, so this is in the sort of a little past mid 19th century, when Italy is uniting and you have Italian nationalism on the rise, Freemasonry is a big part of this. So I think that Freemasonry provided a space that was sort of hidden from the church, where people could discuss these ideas about like democracy and equality and those kind of things. And this is the typical sort of Freemason stuff, but there was a very specifically revolutionary undercurrent with Italian Freemasonry, maybe a little different from like British or American style Freemasonry.
Yeah, and if I could, I guess, jump in here and a little bit of the history. So Freemasonry, well, except for those of you who maybe think that it started as an ancient craft with the stonemasons back in the medieval era. The United Grand Lodge in England, in London, was sort of the home base of Freemasonry, and it was founded in the 18th century, 1717, or at least that's the date that they claim it was founded. That's the kind of Freemasonry that like the founding fathers were part of in the U.S. A lot of them, George Washington, and one of the requirements of that branch of Freemasonry, of the Freemasonry that's descended from that lodge, is actually you have to be a theist. You have to believe that God exists. Now, there was another lodge in France, in Paris, called the Grand Orient Lodge. And there's a branch of Freemasonry, or a part of Freemasonry. I guess these Masons don't like each other. I don't know if there's been any violence or conspiracism between the two, because, from the outside, we're looking at it as it's all kind of the same thing. But I think but one of the keys to the Grand Orient Lodge and what we call continental Freemasonry, which also spread to places like Italy, and I believe South America and Latin America, and I think Pope Francis actually had some negative dealings with Freemasonry in Argentina that was of this kind. They allowed atheism. They were atheistic Freemasons, and in a lot of cases, they were actually, based on my research, they were violent. They, when we talk about plotting against the Catholic Church, like this is really what they're referring to. So P2 was disaffiliated somehow from the Grand Orient Lodge. So this was sort of like an even more extreme or a break off from that. So this was sort of an exclusive Italian lodge.
So there was this involves a person named Licio Gelli. He was a Freemason who I believe was part of the Grand Orient, or basically a mainstream Italian Freemason. He had been a hardcore fascist under Mussolini, as many of the people we're going to talk about were former fascists. Now, it's not all that unusual at this time in Italy, but these guys seem to have maintained a strongly ultra-right type of perspective. So he formed a breakaway Masonic lodge called Propaganda Due. Now, I believe that the lodge had existed actually before, but he kind of took this lodge over and then reworked it into something that was entirely his own. So it was not authorized. They apparently didn't practice any Masonic ceremonies or rituals like the usual, like none of the levels and all the secret knowledge and all that stuff, like unlike traditional Masonry. And then unlike traditional Masonry as well, it wasn't revolutionary, or it was not sort of a liberal orientation. It was.
So what was their purpose?
It was a far right organization essentially, and they basically stood for anti-communism and the maintenance of free market, what I would consider like a sort of gangster capitalism. So that was one thing that united them. They were all, intensely anti-communist. And there was some communist, influence in Italy at the time. How serious it was is hard to say. They were like communist, like there was Communist Party and that sort of thing. But they formed a sort of, it's basically a reactionary organization of reactionary capitalists, people who are in high positions, and they're kind of using this idea of a Freemasonic lodge, but it's not really a Freemason lodge. It's basically just a secret organization. The members didn't all know each other, so there was no the master list of members was always hidden. They never met at any point in time. Again, unlike normal Masons who have meetings at halls and that sort of thing. Apparently the way that Jelly would bring people into this, because he wanted all the people who were kind of high up in the financial, political hierarchy in Italy to be part of this. And so it was largely through blackmail. That was one of his favorite techniques, apparently, or helping people get jobs, positions, that sort of thing, or giving them the impression that he had helped them get a job or a position. So it was like, nepotism, corruption, blackmail. That's how he pulled people into this. And that's eventually why people wanted to become part of it. Now, it's not a conspiracy theory. P2 existed. It became a huge scandal in the early 1980s. One of the members was apparently Silvio Berlusconi at that time, who later became a major figure in Italian politics a little later on, as a kind of, it was again this sort of like gangster capitalism type, right-wing gangster capitalism. That's his sort of style. Now, eventually P2 grew and it had major influence in Italy, to the point that, some people would say, there's no way you can get anywhere in Italy without being part of P2 if you really want to get into the upper reaches of the, the hierarchy here. And apparently they also had influence in some other countries. So in Argentina, this is a little later in the 80s, so early 80s, apparently the junta that was in control there were members of P2 involved in this. So I think it was maybe Bolivia as well. I'm not 100% sure on that. But so in this atmosphere, this P2 atmosphere, it starts to intersect with the Vatican in a number of ways. And it's through finance that this happens. So you get this sort of triangle. I'm going to call it a triangle setup of three major figures. And the first is a guy named Michele Sindona, also known as the Shark. That was his nickname. So he was essentially a financier connected to the Gambino mafia family, who operated in the US and I believe in Italy. He became a very good friend of Cardinal Montini, who became Pope Paul VI. So after Montini became Pope, Sindona became a financial advisor to the Vatican and intertwined himself with Vatican finances. So if you go back in time a little bit, the Vatican, when they made the agreement with Mussolini that established Vatican City, the part of this was, I think it was in compensation for the loss of the Papal States, Mussolini gave them a very large sum of money that would eventually become the sort of base capital for Vatican finances moving forward. So after World War II, the Vatican actually comes out of this with a lot of money. And then I think it's in I hope I'm right on this, but the late 1960s anyway, the Italian government wants to take away the tax exemption that applies to the profits on that the Vatican receives from their investments within Italy. So because they think this is not fair, it's putting a huge drain on the Italian economy. So eventually this happens, and the Vatican has to figure out, well, we're not going to get our tax exemption here. We have to diversify. We have to get out of Italy with our money. We have to put our money in other places so it can do its work. And that's where people like Sindona step in. They become these sort of, I think Yallop, think it was Yallop who says it, but they call them like kind of trusted men, like people who work for the Vatican. They're they're these kind of magic workers who can make money. So now the problem is Sindona was basically a genius of fraud. He would use like really elaborate systems of connected banks and shell companies to organize operations where he just seemingly pull money out of nowhere. So, more complicated than the sort of Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme is really like this really elaborate network of banks and shell companies like all over the world, and he's moving things from manipulating markets and manipulating prices and that sort of thing. Now he takes off. He's become this financial star. He becomes the primary shareholder in the Franklin National Bank in the U.S. In the early 1970s, and then that collapses in 1974, and this is kind of the beginning of the end of Sindona, and a lot of Vatican money is lost in the fallout because, again, the Vatican is so intertwined in this, and all of its money is so intertwined. He gets arrested in 1979 after being accused of arranging the killing of a lawyer named Giorgio Ambrosoli, who had been trying to unravel the trail of fraud that Sindona had left. And then he died in 1986 in prison after being poisoned with cyanide. So he had earlier tried to kill himself using a drug called digitalis, but it didn't work. But this time it was apparently a hit. He was killed with cyanide in his coffee. So this is all real. He's very real. Like it sounds incredible, but yeah, this guy was a real guy. You can read about him in all the big newspapers and of the time. And so he's one of the three. Another guy is a person named Roberto Calvi, and he was known as God's banker. And he got that nickname because he was the chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, which was a very large Italian bank known for its connection to the Catholic Church. So Calvi, like Sindona, and often in partnership with Sindona, was involved in these elaborate fraud schemes. And after there was a big financial scandal at the Banco Ambrosiano that he was the chairman of in 1978, he was investigated and put on trial. He appeals, because I guess in Italy, just getting arrested and put on trial, that's the first step in a long, endless thing where you get, appeals that last forever and you're walking free and all this kind of stuff, like for ages. It's just the usual thing. In 1982, Calvi leaves Italy and unexpectedly ends up in London, England. And on June 18th, 1982, Calvi, God's banker, as he was known, he's found hanged under Blackfriars Bridge in London, and his pants and his pockets are filled with bricks. So this makes.
I heard it was rocks. Was it bricks?
Oh, okay. I had heard bricks, but it might have been rocks. Yeah, he was weighed down essentially. So
well, I thought it was like symbolic. Was the I think the stones were symbolic of stonemasons or something like that. I don't.
There is an argument that he was maybe killed, I think, by Freemasons, but not regular Freemasons, again, by Propaganda Due people who they knew that, because Propaganda Due was all caught up in this as well, because Sindona and Calvi were both members. They were both, very intertwined with Licio Gelli. And a lot of the money they were making, this was all coming into, Propaganda Due through Gelli. So it became part of this this sort of apparatus of power within Italy at the time. So yeah, he's found hanged, and then right at this moment, basically, Banco Ambrosiano collapses. It's a major disaster. It takes huge amounts of Vatican money with it. And eventually in 1984, the Vatican agrees to pay back over $200 million that was owed to the bank's creditors. And this is interesting. They made an arrangement that they would pay it on the basis of non-culpability but in recognition of a moral involvement. So now, so basically they're saying that, yes, we had a moral responsibility here that means that we should pay back this amount of 200 million, but we don't feel that we were culpable in this. So it's a very tricky sort of statement. So you have the shark, Michele Sindona, you have God's banker, Roberto Calvi, and then the third person who enters into this is Bishop Paul Marchinkas. I think he was later made Archbishop Paul Marchinkas. So he's an American bishop from Illinois. He, grew up in this very kind of tough working class environment. He was really huge and like very tall and big and intimidating. And he was called the Gorilla. That was his nickname. Yeah. And he became a bodyguard for Paul VI. He ends up becoming president of the Institute for the Works of Religion, the Vatican Bank, in 1971, even though he had no financial experience. So he zero, financial training, but he gets this position and he kept it until 1989. So he was there for quite a long time. So Marchinkas knew Calvi and Sindona well, and he was intertwined with them in ways that are only partially understood. So he was on the board of directors for Ambrosiano Overseas. So this is like a division, I guess, of Banco Ambrosiano, which was run by Calvi, because Calvi and Sindona had arranged to make him a member of the board of directors to give it an appearance of moral legitimacy, because here you have this, person from the Vatican involved in it. And so over the years, he helps the bank, the Vatican Bank, become this financial powerhouse, using, working, it seems anyway, with people like Roberto Calvi and Michele Sindona in order to make money for the Vatican. So now the problem is when you're looking at Paul Marchinkas, he had diplomatic, immunity because he was within the Vatican. He couldn't be, arrested. He couldn't be, it's very difficult for the Italian. There he is. Yes. The gorilla. Yeah. Paul Marchinkas. So there were just incredible rumors around him regarding the extent of his involvement with Propaganda Due and with Sindona and Calvi. But I have to admit, to me, it's not convincing that there's no kind of smoking gun that would show that he had a really deep involvement. It's clear that he was involved. He worked with at least with Roberto Calvi very closely. And it seems undeniable that the way he handled Vatican finances allowed for Vatican finances to become very intertwined with the financial operations that these guys ran. And so made a lot of money for the Vatican, but also compromised the Vatican morally, perhaps because of their involvement in this. And then also, financially, because there were times when they lost a great deal of money, like when Sindona's bank collapsed and when Calvi's bank collapsed. So I don't know if that captures the sort of overall atmosphere there, or the overall situation. So
and I think one of the keys to Marchinkas was that he was totally unqualified for this position, right? Like he had no background in financing or banking or accounting or economics or anything like that. He was, basically a bureaucrat who worked his way up and was picked as a nice appointment for a job that had to go to a member of the clergy, and he was deemed a worthwhile candidate.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people at the Vatican probably also don't know a lot about money, and especially like the popes, and so when they see someone like him making money for the Vatican, and they just think, well, that's good, what's wrong with that? We're making, we're getting some good returns on our investments, and what can we say about that? That's nothing. They don't quite understand that there can be, you have to be very careful when you're dealing with those kind of sums of money and the way that they're used, right? And I think it seems like at this time in Italy, especially, it was kind of like Wild West when it came to capitalism. There was huge amounts of financial crime and corruption, and it extended from Italy to other parts of the world as well. So, and we're still dealing with this kind of thing with Vatican finances. There have been some major scandals. Well, you talk about
like London investments and Elton John movies that Vatican money was tied up in, and all kinds of
even back then there was apparently the Vatican had investments in a company that produced birth control pills, right? And so they had to pull out of that when that was discovered, because there's all these ways that you can become sort of morally compromised, right? If you're not careful. So, I think there's always been attempts to rein this in. And I believe that John Paul II tried to do this early on. And then certainly like Pope Francis has tried to do this as well. But it does seem to be a battle that has to be fought all the time. And I think it's just because the world of finance is incredibly complex, and it's a bit of an amoral world in some ways, right? So you have to be, as a moral institution, you can very easily compromise yourself. So the way that this all kind of connects to John Paul I is that apparently John Paul I was going to make changes to the Vatican Bank and call for a sort of transparency that would expose Marchinkas and his connections to Sindona and Calvi. He had been familiar with Calvi because I think it was in the 1960s, or it might have been, it may have been the 70s. It was when he was Archbishop of Venice, when Luciani was Archbishop of Venice, when Calvi had taken over a bank that he and a lot of the priests used because of the special interest rates they were given because of their clerical status. He took it over, and then they lost all the special interest rates, and I think Albino Luciani at the time saw it as a scandal that this had happened, that this bank, Banco Ambrosiano, and this guy Roberto Calvi, who's supposed to be kind of working for the Vatican and respecting the Vatican, that he would do this. So there was a bit of blood there already. But the idea is that these reforms that he was going to introduce would compromise Sindona, Calvi, and then it would also compromise Licio Gelli, who was leading P2. And so this would be the end of their financial empires. It would be the end of P2, potentially. So Yallop suggests that John Paul I was assassinated essentially on the order of Gelli, Calvi, Sindona, or perhaps all three of them, maybe with the involvement of Marchinkas or Cardinal Vio. So if we run with that idea, and I'm not saying I believe it, I actually don't think it's likely, but you might propose that, maybe if he was assassinated by these guys, if they managed to get someone in to poison his coffee with the digitalis, maybe Cardinal Vio found, or someone found the body, realized what had happened, that it had been assassinated, decided to cover it up to avoid scandal, because if it was found out that he was assassinated, that might lead people to investigate, that might lead people to find out about Calvi, Sindona, and all the Vatican finances and all that kind of stuff, and it might kind of again open them up and make them vulnerable. So he might have tried to cover it up in that sense and make it look like it wasn't an assassination. But that's just another possible angle.
And there's no evidence that John Paul I actually had like enemies that he had called out, or had he as Archbishop of Venice. I mean, I guess that's kind of the question. It's like who really hated him, as opposed to, oh, we've had this sudden death. It seems fishy to me. Let me see what the possible ways were that this could have been a murder.
Yeah, I really, when you look at it, realistically, I can't see anywhere where he had real enemies, like where people were really out to get him to the point where they wanted to do him physical harm. I think there were people who were worried maybe about his papacy, about where it would go and what was going to happen, because he was a bit of a, was a bit unpredictable at that point, where what direction he would take. Maybe there were people worried about him, looking too hard into Vatican finances or making changes that might expose some shady dealings. But I can't see any of that leading necessarily to murder. Now, there is another angle that fits in with this as well, in that around the time that he became Pope, JP1, there was a journalist named Carmine Pecorelli, this is a guy who ran this sort of gossip rag in Italy, but it was one of these things where he'd kind of like spill this information and publish it, and it would often be like kind of scandalous stuff about politicians or finance that was going on, and it tended to have like sometimes some relation to truth, like a lot of people were paying attention to it because it seemed like he had inside sources. Now, it turned out later he was a member of Propaganda Due, but he published in 1978 a list of alleged Vatican Freemasons. And if you can find it on traditionalist sites, it's called the Pecorelli list. And I can't remember how many people were on the list. Maybe
like a good 40 or 50, wasn't it?
Good 40 or 50, yeah. And with some relatively famous names like Baggio, Bonini, Casaroli, but also Marchinkas, Paul Marchinkas, and Cardinal Villot. Now, there's no way to know if this is based on anything. It seems like he was trying to say that these people were regular Freemasons, like not part of Propaganda Due, although Pecorelli himself was part of Propaganda Due. There was a list that was found in the early 80s when the offices of, I believe it was Licio Gelli, were raided, and I think it was a list of about almost close to 1,000 people who were part of P2, and that actually got out into the public. But I don't believe there were any Vatican.
I think there were no clerics on that.
No,
list.
It was all politicians.
I didn't know you were going to bring this up, because I know that we were kind of discussing this rumored list this past week with Nathan Turowski. And something we want to go into in a future episode is to try to separate what this whole Freemason thing, which, if it's a Catholic conspiracy theory, there are Freemasons. And it's like, well, obviously Freemasons are real.
Yeah.
Popes have written against it. It's against canon law to be a Freemason. I mean, there are real concrete things there, but everything gets blamed on Freemasons. I was able to dig up in recent months a list of, or not a list, a couple of responses to that list that were in, I believe, in La Civiltà Cattolica, like the official Vatican newspaper, and written by maybe somebody who was framed about being on the list, or who was saying, I mean, here's the amazing thing about Catholic conspiracy theories. Like, it's a world that's just large enough that the conspiracy theories begin to touch the culture. But it's not big enough that the debunkers make any noise. If that makes any sense. Like, you look at something like 9/11 conspiracy theories, or Kennedy conspiracy theories, or moon landing conspiracy theories, huge conspiracy theories. Most people don't even care about the conspiracy theory. Then there's like 5% of people who really do believe in this conspiracy theory. And then relative to that number, maybe 10% of that number is willing to do the work to debunk the conspiracy theories. But the problem with Catholic traditionalist conspiracy theories, I find, is that even if these conspiracy theories have survived since the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, like, these stories have gotten circulated, these magazines got passed around, and if they did get debunked in the 70s, you've got to dig in and do the research to find the documentation. Like that's something that I'm continually finding. And the crazy thing is, I find that the best debunkers of conspiracy theories are from other conspiracy theorists who don't like the conspiracy theory because it doesn't favor their side. So like when you take,
I found that so often. Yeah.
Sede Vacantis, for example, they have all these conspiracy theories about how, leading to this conclusion that John the 23rd was not a legitimate pope. And then, and the place where you find the best arguments for why he was a legitimate pope is when you go to the SSPX documentation and vice versa. Like, the teachings on the church on whether or not a pope can be a legitimate pope and be a heretic. Like, there are a lot of teachings out there that say that. Most ordinary Catholics just sort of take it for granted. Of course, the pope's not a heretic. Like, that's silly.
Yeah.
The Sede Vacantists also believe this, whereas the SSPX believes that the pope is a heretic. But if you go to the Sede Vacantis site, they have like this wealth of, theological work and magisterial teaching that says a pope cannot be a heretic.
Yeah.
And they're directing it at the SSPX. So, I mean, it's kind of a funny world. Or Malachi Martin.
Yeah.
If anyone's familiar with him, and I think we'll have to dedicate a show to Malachi
A show
Martin.
to him. Absolutely.
He was a Jesuit priest who was active during Vatican II, left the priesthood ostensibly, although he claims that he was actually he was still a priest, but he was on a secret mission from Paul VI, and he moved to New York City. He was an Irishman, and he was there to help, I don't know, spy on Masons or write pulpy novels. But it's funny because there's a lot of documentation about him actually getting kicked out of the Jesuits for adultery, sleeping with a married woman. And I found all of those documents from, Vatican sources, from the Jesuits, on a strongly anti-Semitic website of people that didn't like Malachi Martin because they thought he was an undercover Jewish agent. So they're the ones who actually took the time.
They're really right.
This guy.
Exactly.
I mean, it's one of the. So I mean, that's an area where it's like, I really want to like.
Well, it shows that, like, I mean, some of these people who get deep into conspiracy theory, they can do critical thinking and critical work when they're trying to argue against their enemies, or or trying to debunk things that people are saying about them, or that kind of thing. But the thing that they believe in, the thing that's actually driving their conspiracy theories, they can't apply it to that, but they can apply it to other things, and it's really fascinating. You can end up falling down lots of rabbit holes.
It's holding on to that ideology as this is what I'm going to hold on to, and I'm not going to let go of this, and no matter what, and everything I see, everything I study I'm only going to see the stuff that relates back to that. And I think that's a natural human tendency. But if you're Catholic, which requires a conscious choice and profession of faith, then your ground level should be following Christ and the church he founded, rather than there were KGB agents at the Vatican in 1958 who threatened to nuke unless the right papal candidate got elected.
Yeah, you have to have a certain level of trust, and that's what Brett Selkold was talking about before, like a certain level of trust in authorities when it comes to, say, like science and just the basic facts, but also some level of trust in the church. I think you have to. It doesn't mean you have to think that everything the church does is good, or that they never make mistakes, or that but I think you have to start off with at least some level of trust, and then you can then be critical from there. But if you start off with an attitude of like radical skepticism, and I think people like Yallop, they really don't have a lot of faith in the church as an institution, and they see it as just, these people are just like anybody else, out to, for their own benefit, and out to, if you start off with that perspective, I think you can end up becoming too skeptical. You can end up becoming too conspiratorial.
And I don't think there's, I think the thing is, there are a lot of people out there who are Catholic, and maybe through their study, their experience, maybe, they witness some corruption. Maybe maybe a teaching just doesn't make sense to them.
Yeah.
If you're going to reject something, that's been my whole point with Pope Francis the whole time. It's like, this is the teaching on the death penalty. The one that Pope Francis put out, it's on the books. It follows all the rules for what is the official Catholic teaching on the death penalty. Mm-hmm. If you doubt that teaching, just be honest with the fact that you're struggling with what the Catholic Church teaches. And, but instead it's this, what I am is Catholic, and I'm going to try to fit everything else into that. I'm going to try to fit my ideology into that. And if this doesn't fit my ideology, then it's not Catholic, which isn't what the church teaches. You can't change the actual fact, the actual content.
Yes. And keep in mind that the church is run by humans, right? And, even though this is, church that, Christ, gave us, it's still run by humans, and even the Pope is a human, and people who,
and it always was
run by humans. It always was run by humans, and humans make mistakes. And even if they have, even if they're infallible in certain circumstances, they can still totally mess up in other circumstances, right? So that can happen. So when I look at all of this, the impression I get is it's quite possible that the Vatican got itself, in too deep, basically, in a world of finance that, for whatever reason, whether through ignorance or through just, wanting, someone like Paul Marchinkas maybe wanting to just make a lot of money and show off, got involved too deep with people who are connected to secret societies, to the mafia, to, those kind of things. And I'm sure it still happens. It's quite possible. It's, it's very easy. We know there's financial scandals that have been happening right now that it's still unclear what the details of these are, but people make mistakes. There's sometimes bad actors. It happens. And I find it fascinating. So all of this stuff that Yala outlined, it really is fascinating. It shows you the cultural context of Vatican life at that time, which is just crazy. Because, this person, Pecorelli, who published this list of Vatican Freemasons, he ended up being assassinated, killed in his, shot to death in his car by apparently a radical left-wing organization, but who may have been hired by a right-wing organization, or maybe Propaganda Due, or who knows what, so that's the kind of atmosphere you get in Italy, it seems, right? And the Vatican is like right in the middle of all that. So I don't know if it's quite the same today, but it seemed like in the 70s and 80s, it was very much like that. And it's all documented stuff. But again, it's a big stretch to make the assumption that all of this lined up into a conspiracy to take out the Pope. It's almost like it's hard to imagine that even, the most hardened sort of mafia style mind would think that, this would be a good idea to try to take out the Pope. I think there would be a million other things they would try to do first.
And pull it off successfully. But that's
and to pull it off successfully. It's so again, a lot of this is unfalsifiable. Basically, it's whether or not you kind of buy into Yallop's argument. And I buy into some of what he's saying. It's fascinating stuff. It's cool. It's it's like Godfather type material, right? I don't quite buy into the idea that John Paul I was that connected to this. When I brought up the Pecorelli list, though, because apparently, Yallop says that he was going to basically reorganize the Vatican, and the people who he was taking out of their posts, including people like Marchinkas, people like Cardinal Villot, were people who had been on this list. Now, I don't know if there's really any evidence that John Paul I ever saw that list, although I guess this Pecorelli, his magazine was passed around Italy a lot. Like it was, people knew about it. It was a big thing. So it's likely, but whether he would have believed it, whether he would have, we don't know if it was, we have no idea if the list was all true, if it was half true, or if it was completely false. We just don't know, unfortunately. And so until like more evidence comes along, I'm just going to say, I don't think these people were directly involved in the death of John Paul I. And I think, it's the most boring option, I think. But, after all the stuff we've looked at with the idea of people who are afraid of him changing Catholic teaching on birth control, or who are afraid of him challenging the authority of the Curia, or taking the Freemasons out of the Vatican, or exposing the financial dealings of Paul Marchinkas. In the end, even though all of that sort of fascinating context, and there's probably like more than a few grains of truth in some of it, in the end, I don't see why we have to jump to the conclusion that his death was anything but natural. That's I think
that's your story, and you're sticking
that's the story. Yeah.
So
but anyway,
we're way over time.
We're way over time. It's
so more intrigue and excitement. Jose Rodriguez wants to know. Oh, come on. maybe next week we'll talk about that one, Jose.
We'll skip that one for now.
We'll skip that one for now, but he's suggesting another. He's inventing a conspiracy theory right now. Anyway, if you like Critical Catholic, if you like Where Peter Is, if you like Where Peter Is Live, Peter's Field Hospital, if you like the work that we're doing, please consider becoming a Patreon sponsor. We had a Patreon live party, I guess, happy hour conference call this week with a bunch of participants among the contributors and the patrons. People got to sort of share their stories, and we had a nice little conversation, and hopefully we'll be doing great people from New Zealand, Australia, Spain. Gareth Thomas got up and watched it live, or joined us live from Spain at like 2 a.m. Anyway, until next time on the Critical Catholic, God bless and take care.